Greetings fellow ukuleleans, Jeff Weinberger coming at you here with a new ukulele tutorial. Today I'd like to talk about a new chord progression in our Essential Chord Progression series. And this one includes something called the flat 7 chord. So let me just explain real quick what the flat 7 chord is, and then we'll get into lots of songs that use it. That first one you might have noticed, Sweet Child of Mine. That's a perfect classic example of a rock song that uses the flat 7 chord. It's a huge part of that chord progression. And there's millions of other songs too. But what is the flat 7 chord? Well, there's a couple of ways to explain it. There's a more kind of geeky music theory way of explaining it. If you want to get way into music theory, it's something called modal interchange or something called borrowed chords. And I'll explain that first because I want to get over with that so that I can show you my simpler explanation of it. But modal interchange and borrowed chords are just simply when you have a song and you're building the song from only the chords of the key, the diatonic chords that come right from that scale. But sometimes you need something a little different. You need to have a sound in there that's just not included in those 7 chords. That can be a limited choice, sometimes only having 7 chords to work with. So you borrow a chord from another key. In this case, a Sweet Child of Mine, we were in the key of D. That's the key that Guns N' Roses recorded it in. Although they tune their guitars down a half step, so technically D flat. But we're not going to get that into the detail. Let's pretend it's in D. So you have D, and then you have C. Well, C is not in the key of D. Normally, the 7th chord in the key of D is something called C Sharp Diminished. But number one, that's way too long to say for most rock and rollers. That's way too much. Rock and roll tends to use simpler chords that just have short names like A minor or G or D7 or stuff like that. So C Sharp Diminished. That's like a little hoity-toity for a rock and roll tune. So it doesn't even sound right. C Sharp Diminished would be a chord like this. That just doesn't fit into this kind of 70s, 80s rock thing. It totally is wrong. And so we substitute. We find a chord that's more suitable, and we actually borrow that from another key. In this case, the key of D, we're borrowing the chord C to replace C Sharp Diminished. And that totally works. And that key of that chord C, that could have been thought of being borrowed from the key of C. It's also in the key of F. C is also in the key of G. So there's a few keys that contain the chord C. You can think of it as borrowing that chord from one of those keys. Modal interchange, I won't get into that concept. That is way too academic and kind of college music, conservatory level type stuff. So we're not going to talk in those terms. But I would like to talk about this term that I've used for years, for decades now. When I explain this to students early on, I formed this theory about that phenomena of using chords outside the key, and I call them altered rock chords. And I consider altered rock chords to be chords that, yeah, you borrow it from another key, but they tend to sound bluesy, edgy. They tend to be a little more aggressive than the diatonic chords. When you play a song using only diatonic chords, it tends to be very pretty. And, you know, that kind of pretty sound isn't always conducive to a rock and roll attitude, to snarling punk rock, metal, leather and spikes kind of attitude. It just doesn't suit the music at all. It's maybe good for an Elton John song, a ballad, or something by Bob Dylan, you know, something that's strummed on an acoustic guitar and it's kind of folk rock. But metal and the aggressive bluesy kind of forms of rock got to have other sounds. So I always call that altered rock harmony, where you take the 7th chord that used to be a C Sharp Diminished and you turn it into a C. That's a lot more rock and roll. There are other chords of the key that you could alter. The 3rd chord of the key, in the key of C, let's switch over to C for a second. The chords in the key of C we've learned in other videos are C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished. Well, that 3rd chord, E minor, it's beautiful. Hear it in Puff the Magic Dragon, and you hear it in different drum, and there's lots of songs I've taught in videos on my other channel and on this channel that use that 3 chord, the E minor, but it's not very rock and roll sounding. It just doesn't have an aggressive sound to it. But as soon as you swap that out and do an E flat chord instead of an E minor, especially if you strum it in kind of a rock and roll way with a rock attitude. Very different scenario there from it's just it's the difference between Puff the Magic Dragon by Peter, Paul and Mary and Ted Nugent or something like that, to give you an extreme example. So we alter regular diatonic chords sometimes to produce a more rock sound. That's the way I think about this stuff. Let's go over some songs that use that. You heard me playing that intro to Sweet Child of Mine. I had just worked that out, honestly. I know I might disappoint some of you that might have thought that I spend like, weeks and weeks practicing and preparing the pieces that I play in these tutorials. But to be honest, sometimes I slap them together 5 or 10 minutes right before I turn on the camera, and that is the case. I just taught myself the riff to Sweet Child of Mine on the ukulele, although I played it for years on the guitar. I never actually did it on the uke, and so I'll show you that if you want me to. If you want to hit me up in the comment section down below. I'd be glad to send that to you, to send you the tabs so you can learn how to play that. It's kind of funny being able to play such a iconic rock and roll riff on such a diminutive little instrument like the ukulele. But I like to do things like that. I like to do the unexpected and things that are supposed to be not acceptable or wrong. I'm just kind of a rebel in that way. But I'm not the first. I'm not going to claim like I invented that. We know Jake Shimabukuro and lots of other people are out there on the ukulele doing things that the uke isn't supposed to be capable of, and surprising people. So it's that's pretty mild compared to what some people out there are doing. But I just get a kick out of it, playing such a like a rock kind of thing on a little Hawaiian instrument here. I think it's great. So let's do some other songs. We have Rock and Roll by Lou Reed. That's a perfect example of the flat 7 chord. Lou Reed recorded that song in the key of C. He did it with the Velvet Underground back in '69, but then he redid it with his own group in '74, I believe it was. He had a live album called Rock and Roll Animal, which is an incredible album that has great guitar playing on it. It's got great just performance of a rock band, a really finely practiced and honed rock band. That's also where Sweet Jane came from, in case you're wondering. We have that live version of Sweet Jane with that long guitar intro that's so cool, very 70s. That's called Rock and Roll Animal. But anyway, this Lou Reed song called Rock and Roll is simply this. It's just C, it's B flat, it's F, and it's C. Has lyrics about when Janie was just 5 years old, there was nothing going on at all, but then she found that fine music because she turned on the radio and heard rock and roll, and about how rock and roll changed somebody's life. And that song Rock and Roll from way back then, that's a really good example. C is the 1 chord in the key of C. B flat, that's the flat 7 chord, and then F is the 4 chord, and that's the chord progression we're talking about today pretty much for all of these examples, is 1 flat 7 4. And so maybe before you started watching these videos on common chord progressions and music theory, that kind of talk was above your pay grade. You might have thought, oh, he's talking about the 1 chord, the flat 7 chord, the 4 chord. What's that? That's like some foreign language. That sounds like nuclear physics or something. But if you understand some of this basic music theory and harmony, that's nothing to think about the 1, the flat 7, and the 4. That's basic music theory. That's not high level music theory like we would need to use if we were discussing symphonic music, or we're talking about John Coltrane or something like that. Music that just has more complications to it. So hopefully that doesn't scare you when I say 1 flat 7 4, but I literally mean C, B flat, and F. Not a big deal. Let's move on and learn the chords to Sweet Child of Mine, which, like I said, if you really want to learn that riff, I'll send that out to you. But the main chords are going to be D, C, G, and back to D. And lots of songs have that. We're going to look at some songs that came way before Sweet Child of Mine that use those same chords. But D is the 1 chord, C is the flat 7 instead of C sharp diminished, which normally is the 7, and then G is the 4, 1 flat 7 4. There it is again. So we had Lou Reed, we had Guns N' Roses. Let's keep going. Sympathy for the Devil by the Rolling Stones. That was even earlier than all this music we're talking about. So Sympathy for the Devil, that was like late 60s. That song, Pleased to Meet You, Hope You Guessed My Name. If you've ever turned on a classic rock radio station anytime in your life, you've probably heard that song, even if you didn't grow up with it like I did. There is a great kind of video on the making of that song, the Rolling Stones, how they started off with a very different song than it turned into. They show the evolution of that song from its inception when Keith Richards came up with that chord progression, to Mick Jagger writing the lyrics down on a little notepad sitting on the floor of the studio, to them bringing in a conga drummer and adding some percussion, and great video on the making of that song. Also, if you ever watch Rock and Roll Circus, which was a gathering for British TV of the Rolling Stones, The Who, Jethro Tull, John Lennon, all kinds of people, they played Sympathy for the Devil for that crowd at Rock and Roll Circus. So I will put links down below for both of those, for the making of Sympathy for the Devil video, which is very interesting, and to Rock and Roll Circus. So I'll give you a little slice of what things were like back then in the really kind of golden years of rock and roll, when rock and roll was really creative and exciting, and there were all these innovations going on and just a whole lot of energy behind it. Rock and roll is still great today. There's still some excellent bands, but that was kind of a special time in the history of it, and it will never be again. That was, that was then, this is now. All right, so speaking of which, let's get on to a tune from way back then, Sweet Home Alabama. I remember hearing that song over and over, and when I started playing guitar, I couldn't pick up a guitar without somebody asking me to play that song, or Free Bird, or some other song by Leonard Skinner. They were hugely popular in the 70s, so, and then they continued to be well after the 70s. So let's check out Sweet Home Alabama. That is the chord progression D, C, and G, just like lots of the other songs we're talking about here. So it's it just kind of has that southern fried kind of southern rock vibe to it that makes it a little different from maybe Guns N' Roses, which was more of a 90s hair metal, LA, Hollywood kind of vibe, or the Rolling Stones, late 60s British psychedelic rock. So all of these are very different types of rock, but they all have that in common, the 1 flat 7 4. Another example, Can't You See by Marshall Tucker, that song with flute in it and stuff. Can't you see? Whoa, can't you see what that woman, she's been doing to me? Do 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 do. That little flute thing. California Girls by the Beach Boys. This is even earlier than some of this music. This even predates some of the other songs we're talking about here. So California Girls. Those West Coast girls are hip, they really dig those styles they wear. Bikini on. I wish they all could be California girls. So the Beach Boys did that, and then David Lee Roth did a cover of that, a really funny video that goes with that, and that was like in those early days of MTV when videos were a thing. And I remember that was a particularly funny video. Love him or hate him, David Lee Roth was a big personality. he took up the whole camera whenever he was on camera. He was a big personality. So yeah, California Girls, very good example of that. That was C, the 1 chord, B flat, the flat 7, F, the 4 chord, and then sometimes it went to the 5 chord right before the chorus, which is G. All right, one last example, because I do believe you probably get the idea at this point, but just to drive it home, Cant Explain by The Who. I played this in my first rock band way back in high school. Got a feeling inside, can't explain. So that song is in the key of E, and E is not a ukulele friendly key necessarily, but it's a very guitar friendly key, and that's The Who being a very guitar oriented band. The chords were E, D, A, and E, the same as Sympathy for the Devil. Roughly the same era too, except the speed, the harmonic rhythm of this is faster. The chords change quicker. So it goes directly from E to D to A to E. So it's a fast chord change as opposed to, say, Can't You See? That's kind of slow and lumbering and it takes its time. All right, ukulele people, hope you enjoyed that very quick explanation of the flat 7 chord and in our search for all these essential chord progressions. I will make not so much tabs available unless you want the Sweet Child of Mine tab, and I'll certainly send you that. I'll scribble that out for you and send that in an email if you let me know. But what I will make available are the titles of all these songs we talked about, links to their YouTube videos, and then any other pertinent information I might find. Maybe I'll give you some song sheets or something like that. So I'll give you everything you need to explore these songs further. And know that this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are lots of other songs. This is just the ones that I thought of before turning on the camera and jotting them down and working out that Sweet Child of Mine riff. I crammed right before I did this video. So hopefully I didn't shatter any illusions about how highly prepared I am for these. I usually know what I'm going to talk about, but I sometimes formulate the examples ahead of time, just a short amount ahead of time, and hopefully that doesn't detract from the quality. But you can always comment on it. You can always give me a thumbs down if it doesn't work for you, and I'll get the message, and maybe I'll practice these a little more beforehand. We'll see if that's necessary, or if you like spontaneity, then I'll just roll this way. All right, ukuleleans, you take care, and I will catch you later. Be sure to subscribe, be sure to like, and be sure to click the notify bell. All right, bye-bye.